Once, there was a king whose very name became a synonym for wisdom. Solomon, crowned with divine favor, overflowing with wealth beyond measure, and wielding power that shook nations. His words built empires of thought. His judgments left enemies speechless, and his reign seemed untouchable. But behind the golden walls of his palace, something began to crack. How does the man who asked God for wisdom above all else end up wandering the corridors of his own soul, muttering that everything is meaningless? How does the wisest king in history write love songs to heaven in one season and in another drift into shadows that even his brilliance could not pierce? This is not just an ancient tragedy, it's a mirror. Because what happened to Solomon can happen to any of us who forget that a crown without God is just an ornament for the grave. Have you ever wondered how close you might be to the same traps, pride, compromise, and the slow, silent drift away from the one who gave you everything? Type 777 in the comments if you're ready to stand firm when the world tries to pull you under. To those who have supported our channel, whether through a super thanks or simply by watching and sharing, thank you from the bottom of our hearts. You're helping us bring stories like this to life. Stories that still speak across centuries. So stay with me. In a moment, we will step into the final, a haunting chapter of Solomon's life, a day filled with glory remembered, mistakes unhidden, and the crushing weight of choices that could not be undone. And in that story, you may just find a warning and a way back. The terrifying end of Solomon will shock you. The Wisest King's Fall. Solomon's reign did not begin as the tale of a man chasing earthly ambition. It began as the unfolding of a divine appointment. He was no ordinary prince. He was the son of David, the warrior king after God's own heart, and Bathsheba, a woman whose life had been marked by scandal, redemption, and grace, chosen by God himself to inherit the throne after David's final breath. Solomon stepped into a kingdom rich with promise but heavy with responsibility. The weight of an entire nation's destiny rested on his young shoulders. From the very first chapter of his reign, heaven's hand was evident. One night, while Solomon was at Gibeon offering sacrifices, something happened that would alter the trajectory of his life forever. Scripture records it in 1 Kings 3:5. At Gibeon the Lord appeared to Solomon in a dream by night, and God said, "Ask for whatever you want me to give you." Can you imagine standing before the Almighty with the chance to ask for anything? Power, vengeance, long years of life. What would your heart choose? Solomon's answer would reveal the depth of his character. Instead of requesting gold to fill his treasuries or armies to crush his enemies, he bowed low before God in humility. "Give your servant an understanding heart to judge your people, that I may discern between good and evil." 1 Kings 3-9. This was not the voice of a man seeking his own glory. It was the plea of a shepherd asking to guide God's flock with justice and truth. He knew, even then, that ruling Israel was not about control, but about stewardship. Heaven's response was immediate and overflowing. The Lord was deeply pleased with this selfless request. In 1 Kings 3:10-14, God declared that Solomon would receive not only the unparalleled wisdom he sought, but also riches beyond imagination, honor unmatched in his generation, and the possibility of a long, blessed life if he remained faithful to God's ways. That "if" would hang over his reign like a quiet prophecy. And soon, that wisdom was put to a test that would etch his name into history. Two women appeared before the young king, each holding the same desperate claim. They were the mother of a single living child. How could anyone possibly know the truth? In a moment that stunned the court, Solomon ordered the child to be cut in half, an unthinkable decree, yet one meant to pierce the heart. He knew the true mother would rather surrender her son than watch him die. And when the woman cried out, "Spare the child, give him to her," Solomon's discernment was confirmed. The case closed, not with the swing of a sword, but with the revelation of a mother's love. Word of this judgment spread like wildfire. From the smallest village to the courts of foreign kings, people spoke in awe. Surely, the wisdom of God is in this man to administer justice. And it was not just a passing reputation. As 1 Kings 4:29-30 tells us, God gave Solomon wisdom and very great insight, and a breadth of understanding as measureless as the sand on the seashore, greater than the wisdom of all the people of the East, and greater than all the wisdom of Egypt. The Riman, word 112, when a thing. Imagine living in a time when one man's voice carried the counsel of heaven itself. Solomon composed over 3,000 proverbs and more than 1,000 songs and kings, 432, words that touched on the mysteries of life, the laws of nature, the art of leadership, and the pursuit of faith. His court became a beacon for rulers and scholars who traveled across deserts to hear him speak. The fame of Solomon's wisdom was not confined to Israel's borders. It reached the ears of distant rulers, echoing across deserts and seas. Among those who heard was the Queen of Sheba, a monarch of extraordinary wealth and influence, ruling over a prosperous kingdom in the southern reaches of the Arabian Peninsula. She was not content with rumors and second-hand tales. Determined to test this king for herself, she embarked on a long and costly journey, bringing with her a caravan laden with spices, gold, and precious stones. When she finally stood in Solomon's court, her presence alone commanded respect. The queen began to pose question after question deep. Intricate matters meant to probe the limits of his understanding. Nothing was too complex for him. With calm authority, Solomon answered each one, weaving together insight, truth, and discernment that reflected the very mind of God. In 1 Kings 10:6-7, her confession is recorded for all generations to read. The report I heard in my own country about your achievements and your wisdom is true. But I did not believe these things until I came and saw with my own eyes. Indeed, not even half was told me in wisdom and wealth. You have far exceeded the report I heard. Her words were more than flattery. They were an admission that what God had done through Solomon could not be contained in mere stories. This moment was more than an exchange between two rulers. It was a public declaration that God's blessing on Solomon was a visible testimony of his favor upon Israel itself. Even foreign powers recognized that this kingdom's greatness was rooted not in military conquest alone, but in the God who had chosen them. Yet, for all his wealth and renown, Solomon's most enduring earthly accomplishment was not a diplomatic victory, but the completion of a sacred dream, one his father David had cherished but never realized. It was the construction of the temple in Jerusalem, described in 1 Kings 6. The temple was a masterpiece of devotion and craftsmanship, an awe-inspiring sanctuary built from the finest cedar of Lebanon, overlaid with gold and adorned with silver, bronze, and intricately carved stone. The scale and precision were unmatched. Every detail reflected reverence for the one it was meant to honor. For 7 long years, artisans and laborers worked under Solomon's command until the day the final stone was set in place. When the temple was complete, it stood as the beating heart of Israel's spiritual life, the dwelling place of God among his people. In 1 Kings 8, 10, 11, we read how the cloud of the Lord's glory filled the house, so overwhelming that the priests could not stand to minister. This was not simply architecture, it was a visible reminder that heaven had drawn near. At its dedication, Solomon stood before the altar, lifted his hands toward the heavens, and prayed a prayer that still echoes with power across the centuries. Recorded in 1 Kings 8, 22, 53. It was a declaration of God's greatness, a plea for his mercy, and a call for his people to remain faithful. He began with words that summed up the heart of his faith. Lord, the God of Israel, there is no God like you in heaven above or on earth below you, who keep your covenant of love with your servants, who continue wholeheartedly in your way. 1 Kings 8:23. Under Solomon's leadership, Israel rose to a place no one could have imagined just a generation earlier. The nation, once forged through battles and wilderness trials, now stood at the very peak of its power and prosperity. Streets bustled with merchants from distant lands, the air heavy with the scent of imported spices and the hum of countless languages. Scholars, emissaries, and kings from far-off realms came not simply to trade, but to witness firsthand the mind and majesty of the man who sat on Israel's throne. The scriptures recorded plainly in 1 Kings 10, 23, 24. King Solomon was greater in riches and wisdom than all the other kings of the earth. The whole world sought audience with Solomon to hear the wisdom God had put in his heart. This was more than political dominance. It was a global recognition that something divine was at work in Jerusalem. His wealth was staggering. By controlling key trade routes between Egypt and Mesopotamia, Solomon commanded the flow of goods that shaped economies. Caravans arrived with gold and silver in a near constant stream. Every 3 years, without fail, his fleet returned from distant voyages, their decks heavy with ivory, gleaming gold, silver, and exotic wonders, apes, peacocks, and treasures that stirred the imagination. 1 Kings 10:22. And the scale of this prosperity was measurable. 1 Kings 10:14 records that Solomon's annual income in gold alone was 666 talents, more than 25 tons every single year. This was not a fleeting windfall, it was the steady heartbeat of an empire whose reach stretched across seas and kingdoms. A rhythm of wealth that the world could neither rival nor ignore. Even his throne seemed crafted not just for a king, but for a legend. Described in 1 Kings 10:18-20. It was fashioned from ivory and overlaid with pure gold. Elevated by 6 steps, 12 lions stood as sentinels, one on each side of every step, a silent symbol that strength and authority guarded the path to Israel's ruler. There was no equal to it anywhere in the known world. The splendor didn't end at the throne room. It extended to the very drinking vessels of the court. 1 Kings 10:21 tells us, all King Solomon's goblets were gold, and all the household articles in the palace of the forest of Lebanon were pure gold. Nothing was made of silver, because silver was considered of little value in Solomon's days. Consider what that meant. A time so abundant that what other nations prized was seen here as nearly worthless. How often in history has a kingdom reached the point where even its lesser metals were dismissed as common? Yet, with the flood of wealth and global prestige came the undertow of temptation. Power, once a gift to be stewarded, and began to shift into a force that drew Solomon toward compromises he may never have considered in his early days. As his influence spread, so did the pressure to secure political alliances with surrounding kingdoms. In the ancient world, such alliances were often sealed not with ink and treaties, but with marriage. The scriptures do not hide the truth. 1 Kings 11:1-2 records that Solomon loved many foreign women, Moabites, Ammonites, Edomites, Sidonians, and Hittites, nations God had warned Israel not to intermarry with, because they will surely turn your hearts after their gods. These were not casual unions. They were direct steps into relationships God had explicitly forbidden, steps that carried the seeds of spiritual danger. Solomon did not take the warning seriously. Over time, his harem grew beyond reason: 700 wives, princesses, and 300 concubines. 1 Kings 11:3. What began as political strategy became an open defiance of God's clear command in Deuteronomy 17. He must not take many wives, or his heart will be led astray. Was this the voice of wisdom yielding to desire, or of a king convinced he could resist the very snares God had named? As the years passed, the subtle influence of these foreign wives began to erode the foundations of Solomon's spiritual life. It was not a sudden collapse, but a gradual turning, a quiet shift of the heart. 1 Kings 11:4 paints the sobering picture. As Solomon grew old, his wives turned his heart after other gods, and his heart was not fully devoted to the Lord his God, as the heart of David, his father, had been. Oft, a life. The tragedy is not merely that Solomon broke God's command, but that he did so while possessing a wisdom no other king had ever known. He had the insight to discern between good and evil, yet he allowed affection for these women to outweigh his devotion to the one who had given him everything. How does a man who once built the temple for the living God now stand at altars built for gods of stone and wood? The decline of Solomon's devotion was no longer hidden in his private affections. It began to take visible form across the hills and ridges of Israel. His disobedience found its expression in the construction of high places, altars raised on elevated ground, visible to the people, where sacrifices and rituals were offered not to the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, but to the gods of foreign nations. In 1 Kings 11:5, the account is stark. Solomon built an altar for Ashtoreth, the goddess of the Sidonians, worshipped through rites of sensuality and fertility that stood in direct opposition to the holiness of the Lord. He also ordered the building of high places for Chemosh, the god of the Moabites, and for Molech, the god of the Ammonites, whose worship involved the burning of children in sacrifice, a practice that God himself declared detestable. These were not mere diplomatic gestures to please foreign wives. They were open acts of rebellion against the covenant God had made with his people. The weight of these choices becomes even heavier when seen against the backdrop of God's explicit commands. In Deuteronomy 12:2-3, Israel was told to tear down and completely destroy such high places, cut down their altars, smash their sacred stones, burn their Asherah poles. The instruction was not vague. It left no room for reinterpretation. Yet Solomon, the king who had once built the temple to honor God's presence, now sanctioned shrines to idols. How could the same hands that oversaw the placement of the Ark of the Covenant now commission altars to gods of wood, stone, and fire? This is the tragic irony of Solomon's story. The very wisdom he had once treasured, the ability to discern between good and evil, was now overshadowed by moral compromise. He fell into idolatry, the very sin God had warned Israel against since the days of Moses. From the wilderness to the threshold of the promised land, the warning had been clear: abandon these gods, or they will enslave your hearts. The scriptures had spoken plainly in Deuteronomy 7:3-4, do not intermarry with them. Do not give your daughters to their sons, or take their daughters for your sons, for they will turn your children away from following me to serve other gods. And the Lord's anger will burn against you and will quickly destroy you. It has not. These were not abstract words. They were the voice of God echoing through centuries, now fulfilled in Solomon's own downfall. The contrast could not have been sharper. David, Solomon's father, had his share of grave failures, yet his heart remained tethered to the Lord. Solomon, on the other hand, allowed his loyalties to fracture. His devotion was no longer singular, it was divided, diluted, and ultimately redirected. And in that division lay the seeds of a downfall that no throne, nor fortune, and no wisdom could prevent. God's anger toward Solomon was neither silent nor sudden. It was the culmination of years in which warning after warning had been ignored. This was not a God who had remained distant. Twice, the Lord had appeared to Solomon face to face, first in the quiet majesty of Gibeon, when his reign was young and his heart still humble, and later in Jerusalem, in the very city where the temple stood as a symbol of his presence. Each time, God reaffirmed his covenant, calling Solomon to walk faithfully and to guard his heart. In 1 Kings 9-6-7, the warning had been crystal clear. But if you or your descendants turn away from me and do not observe the commands and decrees I have given you, and go off to serve other gods and worship them, then I will cut off Israel from the land I have given them, and will reject this temple I have consecrated for my name. Israel will then become a byword and an object of ridicule among all peoples. Thanks for watching. This was not vague counsel. It was a direct cause and effect declaration from the mouth of God himself. Yet, despite hearing it with his own ears, Solomon's heart had already begun to drift. The allure of his wives' gods, the pull of political alliances, and the seduction of cultural acceptance outweighed the voice of the one who had raised him to the throne. He did not simply tolerate the idols he built, shrines for them. He stood by as incense rose to Ashtoreth, Chemosh, and Molech, the smoke mingling with the cries of worshippers to lifeless gods. The man who had once prayed for God's presence to dwell among his people now sanctioned worship that drove that presence away. Finally, 1 Kings 11-9-10 records the divine verdict. The Lord became angry with Solomon because his heart had turned away from the Lord, the God of Israel, who had appeared to him twice. Although he had forbidden Solomon to follow other gods, Solomon did not keep the Lord's command. Willows-a-noun the taught us. The tragedy of Solomon's story is not only that he sinned, but that he sinned against the light of unmatched privilege. Who else in Israel's history had spoken to God in dreams, received his wisdom in abundance, and seen his glory fill the temple? Yet all of it was traded for the acceptance of foreign wives and the favor of gods that could not see, hear, or save. His fall stands as a sobering monument in the pages of Scripture, a caution not only to kings, but to anyone who begins their journey in faith and ends it with a divided heart. For if the wisest man who ever lived could be seduced away from God, what keeps any of us secure except daily, unwavering devotion to him? The God who had once lifted Solomon from the throne room of David into the heights of unmatched glory now spoke with a voice of righteous judgment. The blessings of wisdom, wealth, and honor had been lavished upon him, but they were never meant to excuse disobedience. And now, the same God who had promised abundance also declared the cost of betrayal. In 1 Kings 11:11, the Lord's words fell like a gavel in a courtroom. Since this is your attitude, and you have not kept my covenant and my decrees, which I commanded you, I will most certainly tear the kingdom away from you and give it to one of your subordinates. Watch. This was more than a personal rebuke. It was a sentence that would alter the course of Israel's history. The kingdom, once united in strength and purpose, was now set on an irreversible path toward division, conflict, and eventual downfall. The grandeur Solomon had built with God's blessing would become the very stage upon which judgment would unfold. Yet even in judgment, there was a thread of mercy. For the sake of David, Solomon's father, a man whose heart had remained steadfast toward God, despite his failings, the Lord would not bring the full weight of destruction in Solomon's lifetime. 1 Kings 11:12-13 records his tempered verdict. Nevertheless, for the sake of David your father, I will not do it during your lifetime. I will tear it out of the hand of your son. Yet I will not tear the whole kingdom from him, but will give him one tribe for the sake of David my servant, and for the sake of Jerusalem, which I have chosen. Well, but the mercy did not erase the reality of the judgment. It only delayed its arrival. The kingdom's fracture was certain, and its first cracks began to show in the form of rising adversaries and internal unrest. One of the most vivid and symbolic moments came in 1 Kings 11:29-31. The prophet Ahijah, meeting Jeroboam, one of Solomon's officials outside Jerusalem, enacted a prophetic sign. Ahijah took hold of his own new cloak, tore it into 12 pieces, and said to Jeroboam, "Take 10 pieces for yourself, for this is what the Lord, the God of Israel, says, See, I am going to tear the kingdom out of Solomon's hand and give you 10 tribes. The image was unmistakable. What God had once woven together, he was now tearing apart, not out of cruelty, but as the unavoidable consequence of covenant betrayal. The glory of Solomon's reign, once a shining testimony to God's faithfulness, would now be remembered alongside the tragedy of how swiftly it could be undone when the heart turns away. On the last day of his life, King Solomon, once the wisest and wealthiest man on earth, sat in his vast palace, surrounded by the splendor that had defined his reign. The marble halls still glistened, the golden vessels still shone, and the memories of his incredible achievements lingered in every corner. Nations had marveled at his wisdom. His wealth had been without equal. Under his rule, Israel had reached the zenith of its power, feared and respected across the ancient world. Yet in those final moments, joy was absent. Instead of satisfaction, there was a heavy shadow of loss, disobedience, and regret. The laughter of the courts and the music of celebration had faded, replaced by a silence that pressed in like a weight. His mind could not escape the truth. He had wandered far from the God who had given him everything. The depth of this emptiness is captured in the words of Ecclesiastes, often attributed to his later years. In Ecclesiastes 1:2, the king's voice trembles through the ages. Meaningless, meaningless, says the teacher. Utterly meaningless. Everything is meaningless. Oh, growled art. These are not the careless musings of a man bored with life. They are the confession of someone who had tasted wisdom, wealth, pleasure, and power, yet discovered that without the Lord, It all slipped through his hands like sand as he sat in the palace that once echoed with prayers and praise. Solomon's mind drifted back to one of the most sacred moments of his life, the dedication of the temple. He remembered the day described in 1 Kings 8, the great assembly of Israel, the solemn prayer, and the expectation in the air. He had prayed earnestly for God's presence to dwell there, lifting his hands toward heaven in humble dependence. And God had answered. 1 Kings 8, 10, 11 tells how the glory of the Lord descended like a cloud, so thick and holy that the priests could not stand to minister. It was a day of triumph, a day when heaven touched earth. But those days felt far away now. The same heart that once longed for God's glory had been divided. The same man who had built a temple for the Lord had also built altars for foreign gods. And in that contrast lay the bitter truth. Wisdom without faithfulness leads to ruin. In the quiet of his last day, Solomon understood what his younger self had, not that life's greatest tragedy is not the loss of wealth, power, or even the kingdom itself, but the loss of the closeness with the God who gives life meaning. In his later years, Solomon's reflections grew sharper, stripped of the illusions that had once cloaked his reign in glory. The man who had once been envied for his wisdom, wealth, and power now spoke with a voice that carried the weight of painful truth. In Ecclesiastes 2:10, he lays bare his soul. I denied myself nothing my eyes desired. I refused my heart no pleasure. My heart took delight in all my labor, and this was the reward for all my toil. Yet when I surveyed all that my hands had done, and what I had toiled to achieve, everything was meaningless. A chasing after the wind, nothing was gained under the sun. And Goran, these were not words spoken lightly. Solomon's wealth had made it possible for him to explore every avenue of human pleasure and achievement. He built grand palaces whose walls gleamed with gold, gardens that bloomed in perfect symmetry, and vineyards that stretched as far as the eye could see. He amassed treasures from distant lands, his storehouses overflowing with gold, silver, and precious stones. Exotic animals, apes, peacocks, and rare beasts were brought to his courts to display the reach of his influence. His life was never short of music or entertainment. Hundreds of servants and attendants catered to his every need. Skilled musicians filled his palace with songs that celebrated his reign. Banquets were laid with the finest foods the world could offer. If his eyes desired something, he took it. If his heart longed for pleasure, he indulged it without hesitation. And yet, as the years passed, the joy these things had once promised faded into a dull emptiness. The laughter of feasts could no longer drown out the ache in his soul. The palaces, the vineyards, and the treasures, all of them stood as monuments to a life that had pursued the world but lost its spiritual compass. By the time he penned these words, Solomon knew what his younger self had not. Achievements, no matter how grand, are fleeting without the presence and approval of God. The once wise king now measured his reign not by its glory, but by its drift from the path the Lord had set for him. His later reflections in Ecclesiastes 5:10 capture this truth with piercing clarity. Whoever loves money never has enough. Whoever loves wealth is never satisfied with their income. This too is meaningless. Achan said, here was the hard-won conclusion of a man who had reached the pinnacle of human success, only to find it could not satisfy the deepest hunger of the heart. Solomon had learned too late that unchecked desires, even when fulfilled, lead not to joy but to an emptiness that grows when the soul turns away from God. In his younger years, Solomon's walk with God had been close and vibrant. His reign began with a heart that sought the Lord above all else. When the opportunity came to build the temple, he poured the finest of resources, the skill of master craftsmen, and years of labor into creating a dwelling place worthy of the Almighty. That temple stood not merely as a feat of architecture, but as a living symbol of God's presence among his people, a place where heaven touched earth, where sacrifices were offered, and prayers rose like incense before the throne of the Most High. In those days, Solomon's heart was tender toward the Lord. Twice, God appeared to him, once in Gibeon, granting him unparalleled wisdom, and again in Jerusalem, confirming his covenant. In both moments, Solomon had known the weight of divine favor, the joy of being chosen for a work that would bless generations. The God of his youth was not distant, he was near, guiding and equipping him to lead Israel with righteousness and justice. But as the years unfolded, the very blessings Solomon had received became the soil in which compromise took root. His many foreign marriages, forged in political alliances, brought with them foreign gods. What began as tolerance turned into participation. What began as diplomatic courtesy became spiritual erosion. Idolatry crept in, first in the high places, then into the king's own heart, until the devotion of his early years was but a distant memory. He had forsaken his first love, the Lord who had lifted him to the throne, who had spoken to him in dreams, who had poured out wisdom as measureless as the sand on the seashore. 1 Kings 4:29. The God who once filled his prayers now seemed overshadowed by the altars Solomon had built to please others. Solomon's own writings lay bare the irony of his downfall. In the days of his faithfulness, he had counseled others with words now immortalized in Proverbs 3-5-6. Trust in the Lord with all your heart, and lean not on your own understanding. In all your ways submit to him, and he will make your paths straight. Reva, Riemann till Rowning. These were not hollow words when he first penned them. They were the wisdom of a man aligned with God's heart. And yet, as the years passed, he failed to live by them. Instead of trusting fully in the Lord, he leaned on his own understanding. Instead of submitting in all his ways, he pursued the pleasures, wealth, and alliances of the world. And in doing so, he stepped off the straight path the Lord had once made for him. The tragedy is sharpened by this contrast. The man who taught others the way to life lost his own footing on that very path. In the closing chapter of his life, Solomon left behind words that distilled the lessons learned from decades of triumphs and failures. In Ecclesiastes 12:13, he penned a truth that carried the weight of his entire journey. Now all has been heard. Here is the conclusion of the matter. Fear God and keep his commandments, for this is the duty of all mankind. Reason to know, this was not the counsel of a young man still untested, but the testimony of one who had scaled the heights of wisdom, wealth, and power, only to discover that none of it could satisfy the soul apart from God. After all the debates, pursuits, and experiments with life's pleasures, Solomon's final conclusion was striking in its simplicity. The only true path to fulfillment is reverence for God and obedience to his commands. His last day was not marked by the pomp and celebration one might expect for a king of such renown. Instead, it carried the heavy stillness of a man who knew the cost of turning away from the Lord. He had been entrusted with the greatest of gifts, divine wisdom, unshakable favor, and a kingdom united in peace. Yet over the years, he had squandered these blessings through disobedience, alliances with the ungodly, and the worship of idols. As Solomon faced his final moments, The treasures stored in his vaults and the splendor of his palaces felt hollow. The wisdom that had once drawn kings and queens from distant lands could not undo the choices he had made. The power that had once brought nations to their knees could not restore the intimacy with God that he had lost. In a moment of piercing honesty, recorded in Ecclesiastes 7:29, Solomon confessed, "This only have I found, God created mankind upright, but they have gone in search of many schemes." Loth, it was a sober admission from the man once called the wisest on earth. He recognized that the fault was not in God's design, but in humanity's restless heart, his own included, that turns aside from the straight path in pursuit of its own plans. For Solomon, those many schemes had promised greatness, but delivered emptiness. His final reflections remain a warning to every generation, that wisdom without obedience is powerless, that wealth without devotion is empty, and that the pursuit of anything above God will always end in loss. The man who had everything learned, too late, that the greatest treasure is a heart wholly given to the Lord. Solomon's life stands as a solemn reminder of the necessity of remaining steadfast in our devotion to God. His final day was not adorned with the fanfare of a victorious king, but enveloped in the quiet weight of reflection. In the stillness of his palace, the man who had once been the marvel of nations looked back on the path he had traveled. He remembered the promises, the divine encounters, the unprecedented wisdom granted to him, and the glory of a kingdom at peace. Yet, alongside these memories, there lingered the ache of what had been lost. He had begun with unmatched promise, handpicked by God, blessed beyond measure, and equipped to lead Israel in righteousness. But his final years were shrouded in regret, the consequences of a heart that had drifted. The same man who had built the temple for the Lord, whose prayers once drew down the glory of heaven, had allowed his loyalty to fracture. Foreign alliances, the lure of wealth, and the pull of idolatry had slowly, but surely, turned him away from the God of his youth. The wisest king who ever lived learned, through painful experience, that no measure of wealth, no depth of human wisdom, and no abundance of pleasure can ever replace a heart wholly surrendered to God. All his achievements, palaces, gardens, treasures, and renown now stood as silent witnesses to the truth he came to understand too late. His legacy is sealed in his own final words in Ecclesiastes 12:13. "Now all has been heard. Here is the conclusion of the matter. Fear God and keep his commandments, for this is the duty of all mankind." These words are not mere philosophy, they are the distilled wisdom of a lifetime, spoken by a man who had tested every other road and found them empty. May we take these words to heart and remember that our true purpose does not lie in the pursuit of earthly gain, but in honoring God through faithful obedience. Solomon's life reminds us that the greatest treasures are not found in what we build with our hands, but in the relationship we nurture with our Creator. The final day of King Solomon's life was not marked by the joy of victory, but by the sorrow of a life that had strayed from its original calling. His story leaves us with an enduring truth. It is not how you begin that defines you, it is how you finish. May we all strive to remain faithful to the Lord until our final breath, so that our last day might be marked not by regret, but by the joy of a race well run. Solomon's life is not just an ancient story, it is a mirror held up to every generation, including ours. Here was a man who began with divine favor, wisdom beyond measure, and a heart devoted to God. Yet, over time, The distractions of wealth, power, and misplaced affections led him away from the very source of his greatness. His rise and fall remind us that no one, no matter how gifted or blessed, is beyond the danger of drifting from God. The lesson is piercingly clear. Your relationship with God is the most valuable treasure you will ever possess. You can build empires, achieve your dreams, and be celebrated by the world. But if your heart grows distant from the Lord, all of it will eventually feel like a chasing after the wind. I believe the true success of life is not measured by how high we climb, but by how closely we walk with the one who called us. In today's world, the temptations Solomon faced are still alive. Ambition that overshadows integrity, possessions that replace purpose, and voices that lure us away from God's truth. His story challenges us to guard our hearts, stay anchored in God's word, and finish our race with faith intact. Because in the end, it's not your first chapter that matters most, it's your last. So I encourage you, fear God, keep His commandments, and don't let the noise of this world pull you from His presence. If this message has stirred something in you, take a moment to reflect. Are you walking closely with Him, or have you begun to drift? Let Solomon's story call you back to the path of devotion before it's too late. If this video has blessed you or opened your eyes, please give it a like, share it with someone who needs this reminder, and subscribe so you won't miss more powerful biblical stories. Don't forget to click the notification bell so you're the first to hear them. I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. What part of Solomon's journey spoke most to you today? Thank you for your support. It's because of you, through your likes, shares, comments, and even your super thanks, that we can continue bringing these messages to life. May you walk faithfully, finish strong, and one day hear the words, "Well done, good and faithful servant." 1:30 N.